used to come by the house, knock on the back door at like 4 o'clock in the morning, so my father could give him like a double shot of whiskey, which was verboten, which is forbidden. You weren't supposed to have whiskey.
Right.
But then I know my dad used to go to Indiana, come back with what was called a Alky can, which is a 5-gallon tin can, full of about 190 proof alcohol.
Jesus.
Then they would take a frying pan, go to the stove, put some sugar in the frying pan, brown it up real good, then put that sugar in with half and half of water and alcohol to cut the alcohol from like 180 proof down to 90 proof. They'd mix it with water, and then they would add this brown sugar mix to give it the color of whiskey. And the brewer used to come by, like I said, 4 o'clock every morning. His name was Cook. And he would go come by, get his morning fix of whiskey, then go to work at the brewery, which, like I said, was right next to the ice house.
Right.
What else? That's just some small stuff. We did have one time, and I can remember it very clearly, between my aunt and uncle's house and our house, we had a gangway, not down on the bottom floor. You could go underneath and walk underneath it, but it was like a stairwell. Well, it was not stairs, but just a plain gangway where it was a wooden walkway from the front of the house all the way to the back of the house. And I can remember seeing guys running through the house, or running through the gangway, with guns in their hand, and I'm sure they were federal agents of some sort.
Right.
But you got to remember, I was only like 6, 7 years old. So
that was 18 what?
Pardon?
18 what when you were 7 years old?
Not 18,
I love you, Dick.
Thank you.
You know,
those are interesting times, you know.
Right.
You know, too bad we didn't have a tape recorder.
And what else did you need anyway?
Did you go to the World's Fair in Chicago?
What?
Charlie, you need to speak up.
Did you go to the World's Fair in Chicago?
Oh, yeah, well, yes, I did. But I went with my older sister, Irene, and the rest of the family were there the day before. But when we went, we walked from Cermak, which is 2200 south in Chicago, to Grand Avenue, which is Navy Pier, which is 500 north. In Chicago, 8 blocks is a mile. Okay? So if you figure it from 22nd to 0, there you've got 2 miles, at least. Then another 5/10 of a mile, or 5/8 of a mile when you went to Navy Pier, which gave you roughly 3 miles of walking. Then when you went on Navy Pier itself, you walked probably half a mile out into the lake on Navy Pier. And there we were watching, I can remember watching divers go off of high dives. And then they had at the World Fair, they had a real tall, kind of like a spiral going up probably about 30, 35 feet. And you walked up the stairs to the top, and then you sat on a burlap sack, and you slid all the way down the spiral down to the bottom.
So it's like one of those slides at the fair.
But this one was a spiral, and you were like it slid all the way down to the bottom. But then we also had, at the 1933 World Fair, we had the Skyway, which was like a, I don't know, I guess you could call it a trolley on wires, spread from probably from around I'm going to have to guess at this because I don't remember what the streets were. But it went probably from Navy Pier, I'm going to say over to Grant Park, which was probably 3/4 of a mile, and it would ride back and forth on these trolleys over the fair. And when I was very, very young, I can remember after the World's Fair was over and they were tearing everything down, there was a spot near where we lived, I'm going to go 35th and Racine. It was also part of the old Chicago River, and we called that one at the time Bubbly Creek, because at the time all of the manufacturers, the butchers and the whatever used to dump all their garbage into the river, and it smelled very, very bad, which is why they call it Bubbly Creek. But from 35th and Racine over Bubbly Creek, you could still see part of the Skyway that used to have that tram going back and forth. I was, like I said, a little kid, but I can remember they were taking it down, and I can remember, even from far away as I was, now from 35th Street, it was, let's see, Racine 1200 to State Street, to Michigan Avenue would be another 2 blocks. Probably a good mile and a half, just east and a little bit north. But I watched from 35th and Racine, off of that bridge, I watched that tower when they let it fall. Very slowly, you could watch the tower just go down. Well, some of the interesting things, too. I don't remember if I went on whether we were able to go on the Ferris wheel that year or not. But that day also, since I'm in a bike, I said 6, 7 years old, had a brand new pair of sandals, open shoes. And by the time we got back home that night, after walking all day long along the fair, I had blisters on my feet from the straps of the sandals. Those are some of the more interesting things. That was the World's Fair. Of course, then if you were to go over from our house, which we lived at 37th, if you went to 43rd and Halsted, there was the International Stock Show. Now the stock show, all the producers of, well, all of the big meat packers, Armour, Wilson, who else, some of the bigger names. Anyway, all of the big meat packers had some kind of an exhibit. You had the pork producers, which had huge, huge hogs. They would have hogs there would be 500-600 pounds, even having piglets right there at the fair. And the hog producers would also have big, huge displays of fat, which they cut off of their hogs and then made into lard and made sculptures out of the lard. Whether it was another pig or a lamb or whatever, they would make sculptures out of the lard. And then if you went, as you went through the stock show, you went, of course, you had to see the Clydesdales, Budweiser's Clydesdale horses. Now the stock show had not just horses, but they had cattle raised by individuals as for prime, and they were judged as champions, grand champion, and then they'd have a second grand champion. That was just in the steers, and they'd have milk cows. They had pigs. They had chickens. They had ducks. They had turkeys. It was all kinds of livestock. Didn't make no difference. There was livestock all being judged by judges from different parts of the country to see which was the best of particular breed, whether it was the cattle, a steer, or whether it was a milk cow who produced the most milk, or a sow that produced the most piglets. And the stock show was huge too, because it was also uniquely part of the stockyards itself in Chicago. Now you have stockyards down in Kansas City, but Chicago at that time was the stockyards of the world. Chicago was Armour was the meat packing producers to the world, as what it was called then. And Chicago had that. The stockyards were sprawling all the way from 47th, I'm going to say in Ashland, down to Pershing Road, which was 3900 south, and 47th was 4700 south, and from at least Ashland to Halstead, which was a mile. So you had a mile between Halstead and Ashland, and from 47th to Pershing Road, you had about another mile. So you had like about a 2 square mile area of stockyards. And the city cowboys would be riding their horses, separating the cattle from one pen to another, depending on the breed of the cattle, the size of the cattle, the looks of the cattle, whether they were the best-looking beef or the worst-looking beef. They all separated them. And also individual meat packers would come by, and they would buy certain, let's say we had over in this pen, we had all white-faced steers, or white-faced cattle, which was big at that time. The white-faced cattle, they'd maybe have, 50, 75 head of cattle in there, and these meat producers would come and either bid on them or whatever, and then these cowboys would take those particular animals, go them down to a track, through a chute, and over on into whatever packing company they were going to. What else? The same thing was you had sheep in the yards. You also had, like I said, hogs and pigs. It was very, very, very interesting. As a child or a young snot running around Morgan Street and Pershing Road, that was the end of the streetcar line for Morgan Street. It didn't go any further than Pershing Road. It stopped right there. But in addition to that, coming out of the stockyards, they had a huge, as I said, when they moved those cattle down to different parts of the yards, the stockyards, they also had this big, huge, kind of like a trail built up above the yards where they could move the cattle from one side of the yard to the other. Well, in this particular case, they moved the cattle over the top of all these cattle under an underpass under Pershing Road, which came up right by the end of the streetcar line. Well, I lived, that was at 39th Street, I lived at 37th, which is like 2 blocks. Off of Morgan, I lived between Morgan and Halstead, which was about 2 blocks. But we also had a packing house right across the street from us. Now these city cowboys.